Welcome to the Qasim Rashid Show, a civil rights lawyer here to expose all forms of injustice with a sprinkling of dad jokes in between. Here's your host, Qasim Rashid.
Good morning and peace be upon you this beautiful Sunday, wherever you're tuning in from. My name is Qasim Rashid, and this is the Qasim Rashid Show here on Sirius XM Urban View Channel 126, the most awesome show in the multiverse. My friends, thank you all for tuning in. Thank you for your emails and your notes, your texts, your tweets. You know, it means a lot to me. You know, I appreciate the feedback. You know, I appreciate you guys telling me you're listening, because it's always good to know people are paying attention. And I love the feedback. It's great. Keep it coming. Keep the messages coming. Keep recommending the show. I'm really enjoying this part of it. We've got a great show lined up. I'm going to cover three big aspects. One, DEI. And the whole controversy. MAGAs are now calling it didn't earn it. And it's dovetailing with this horrific tragedy out of Baltimore, because, you know, Baltimore has a black mayor. And of course, we know that that's not allowed. MAGAs are losing their mind that Baltimore is a black mayor. We're going to talk about that in a second. Mayor Brandon Scott. We're going to talk about SCOTUS and the mifepristone ban, alleged ban. Mifepristone, as you know, is an abortion pill that's commonly used, and it's been used since, 2020, for 24 years now. It's been tested by the FDA over and over again. It's very safe, but a Fifth Circuit judge in Texas, appointed by Trump, arbitrarily banned it, and now we're facing a Supreme Court ruling to also potentially ban it. We're going to talk about that. We're going to talk about the Supreme Court's history of, unfortunately, being a pain in the side of civil rights. You know, even before law school, I always thought the Supreme Court, like, this is where justice is upheld, and this is where, you know, bigotry goes to die, and they set the record straight. No, unfortunately, and I'm going to bring the receipts. And I've talked about this on past episodes, but I think it needs to be talked about more often. I'm going to bring the receipts to show that, unfortunately, one of the biggest, and I'm not overselling this, one of the biggest blockades to basic civil rights in the United States is, in fact, the Supreme Court of the United States. It's horrifying. And then I want to close by talking about Gaza. The UN finally passed a binding resolution, 14-0, to call for an immediate ceasefire and release of all hostages in Gaza. And it's wild what's happened since then, because it's clear that the United States and Israel are not willing to comply with this resolution. The United States even came out and said, we deem it a non-binding resolution. There's no such thing as a non-binding UN Security Council resolution. It doesn't exist. There is just no such thing. It's like saying that the 2020 election, even though it was won by Biden, it's a non-binding win. Like, it doesn't work that way. Like, he won, and this resolution is binding. That's just the only way to look at it. So we'll talk about that in a second. But first, I want to start on this conversation about DEI by playing a clip of Baltimore Mayor Brandon Scott on the Joanne Reed Show. It's a minute long. Take a listen.
Now is Baltimore Mayor Brandon Scott. I will allow you, Mayor Scott, if you choose to do so, to respond to the tomfoolery and attacks on you for having the nerve to be black and also a mayor.
Well, I think, listen, I know, and we all know, and you know very well, that black men, and young black men in particular, have been the boogeyman for those who are racist and think that only straight, wealthy white men should have a say in anything. We've been the boogeyman from them since the first day they brought us to this country. And what they mean by DEI, in my opinion, is duly elected incumbent. We know what they want to say, but they don't have the courage to say the N-word. And the fact that I don't believe in their untruthful and wrong ideology, and I am very proud of my heritage and who I am and where I come from, scares them, because me being at my position means that their way of thinking, their way of life, of being comfortable and suffering, and while everyone else suffers, is going to be at risk, and they should be afraid, because that's my purpose in life.
Duly elected incumbent. I absolutely love it. I love it. That's fantastic. I wouldn't have thought of that, because I'm not a duly elected incumbent. But I thought that was beautiful. It was powerful. And Mayor Scott is right. I mean, he's committed the crime of being a black man in America in a position of leadership. And, it's wild to me that these same MAGAs who constantly complain about, people aren't assimilating to our culture, to our country, and blah, 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 blah. Here you have a young person who, and I don't know how old Brandon Scott is, but he looks pretty young. But you're a young person, get involved in the civic process, get elected to a critically important position of public service. And by all accounts, he was asked by media about this, tragedy with the bridge collapse, about how long it'll take to rebuild the bridge. And he said, look, I'm not worried about that right now. There are 6 people missing. We need to find them because human life is first. And they are crucifying this man for putting human life before a bridge. And I get that the bridge is important. I get that people rely on it for its livelihood. But President Biden has already made clear the federal government is spending every resource available to fix the bridge. The mayor's job is to make sure he's protecting people's lives locally, and that's what he's doing. If you haven't been paying attention and you aren't familiar with this bridge collapse, just to kind of bring you up to speed, this was a horrifying incident. 8 workers were fixing potholes when this massive cargo ship hit the Francis Scott Key Bridge in Baltimore. Francis Scott, of course, is the author of the Star Spangled Banner, which is now the national anthem. And these 8 workers plunged into the frigid waters. 2 were immediately rescued, and search and rescue efforts were, enacted for the other 6. And now 2 of those 6 have been recovered. Of course, they've passed away. The other 4 remain missing, and they're presumed dead as well. And the real heroes of the story are local law enforcement, local municipal workers who, when the Mayday call went out from the cargo ship that they've lost steering, within a matter of 4 minutes, they contacted local law enforcement, local municipal workers, and they were able to stop cars from going over the bridge. And as a result, what could have been hundreds and hundreds of deaths has now been limited to 6, which is still tragic. Don't get me wrong. I don't want to compare scars. 6 is still horrifyingly tragic. That said, it's better than 400 to 500, which is what was possible if these local folks didn't act. And so, these victims that were identified are Alejandro Hernandez Fuentes, a native of Mexico, lived in Baltimore, and Dorlian Roniel Castillo Cabrera, a native of Guatemala. And 2 of the missing workers are also from Guatemala and Mexico. Their names are not released yet, but this is the tragedy. These are immigrants making an honest day's work. And as much as immigrants are being demonized, these are the folks who were working at 1:30 in the morning to fix the potholes on the roads you drive on, right? They were away from their families, away from their children, away from their spouses, fixing the potholes so you could have an easier drive the next day. And they did it at night in the freezing cold so that your morning commute wasn't interrupted. This is who immigrants are, right? Every study shows immigrants have a net positive contribution in every sphere of society. Lower crime rates, higher education rates, higher vaccination rates, higher economic output, because they work. And that's what was happening here. And it's a shame, it's a disgusting shame that right-wing MAGAs are trying to demonize the mayor and demonize immigrants. And they're calling it that the mayor didn't earn his election. I mean, I guess they're so used to people like Trump lying about every election. To them, anytime somebody wins who they don't like, suddenly it's didn't earn it. That's how they're labeling DEI. And this is wild. This is my commentary. I mentioned this a little bit last week, but I posted this on social media and it went viral. But it's wild that MAGAs are labeling DEI as, quote, didn't earn it. Because in reality, generating historic wealth through 2 billion acres of stolen land from Native Americans, enslaving Black people for 300 years, banning Asian immigration until 1965, banning women from financial access until 1974, all without paying a single red cent in reparations or restitution. That is a living, breathing example of didn't earn it. How are you going to sit here and ignore 250, 300 years of history, 400 years of history here in the United States of genocide and enslavement and banning and marginalization of Black and brown people, of indigenous people, of women, and then claim that simply wanting equal access, simply wanting meaningful diversity, simply wanting to be included in these conversations, that means you didn't earn it. It's mind-boggling to me. It's absurd to me. And you add to it the other things I didn't even include in this very short list, right? The Japanese concentration camps, where they were giving paltry reparations, I think like $40,000 40 years later, for taking their entire homes and businesses and livelihood to the tune of, tens of millions of dollars or more. FHA redlining, where white Americans were given low interest or zero interest home loans, and Black Americans were denied them. They were redlined out. And those homes are now worth $500,000. This is in our lifetimes, relatively speaking, if you're older especially, that Black Americans were denied what is now $500,000 in home value. And think about the generational wealth that enabled white Americans, that Black people were denied. The GI Bill, right? After World War II, the GI Bill was introduced, or during World War II, to encourage people to enlist. But Black people enlisted and were denied the GI Bill. Think about the tens of thousands of dollars there as well. All the lost wealth of this money and land and housing, the impact it's had on Black and brown people. And the irony is, even today, you look at affirmative action, how MAGAs have repealed affirmative action, but notwithstanding the fact that the data completely undermines their claim that affirmative action is discriminatory, the fact remains that the single demographic that has benefited more from affirmative action than Black people, Asians, Latinos combined is white women. They've benefited the most out of anybody else. But of course, let's ignore that. And while they try to demonize affirmative action, they embrace legacy admissions. And this, to me, is really just takes the cake. You've got legacy admissions at Harvard, for example. A recent study found that 43% of white students, basically every other white student at Harvard, is there on legacy, meaning or athletic scholarships, meaning that they only got in because they had a grandparent or parent attend Harvard during Jim Crow America, when Black people weren't allowed, right? So you want to talk about not earning it, you're getting admission because your parents got in without actually earning it themselves, because their competition was denied the even opportunity. And for those arguing, well, they may be legacy, but I'm sure they still qualified. No, recent Washington Post study found that 75% of white students who got into Harvard on legacy would not have qualified otherwise. They didn't have the scores. They didn't have the grade GPA. They didn't have the resume. They only got in 75%. My God, only got in because of legacy. And we see this play out every single day in the real world. This is not a hypothetical exercise of universities. It manifests every single day. And we're seeing it manifest on a daily basis right now, right? New York, where Kalief Browder was imprisoned for 3 years on a $3,000 bond for an alleged stolen backpack. He never stole it in the first place. 3 years, he was put into solitary confinement. He was tortured. He was abused. He was denied basic human dignity, denied a bond hearing. In that same state, Donald Trump gets his $450 million bond reduced to $175 million. Donald Trump, who was convicted in civil court of rape, is walking free, who's facing 5 different cases right now, multiple criminal cases, walking free, gets his bond reduced to make it easier on him. The alleged billionaire, let's make it easier on him. But the young 16-year-old Black kid who wanted basic human dignity, he's told, tough luck, you suffer for 3 years. In Texas, where Crystal Mason, a Black woman, was imprisoned for 5 years for the crime of filing a provisional ballot on the advice of the poll worker. Crystal Mason had a felony on her record, and we have a racist policy in the United States that if you've committed a felony, you lose your voting rights. There's no logical reason for that. None. No other developed country in the world has this. The United States started to implement this post-Civil War to further disenfranchise Black people. They're like, well, hold on a second. If Black people can vote, they're going to vote for their interests, and it's going to disrupt the white power structure that we have. So let's set up this felony disenfranchisement. And by the way, let's make it a felony to be homeless. Let's make it a felony to loiter. Let's make it a felony to not have a job. Yeah, these are all the black codes. And guess what? It's why black people are over-policed, over-targeted, over-sentenced, longer sentenced, and why at 12, 13% of the population, they represent 40 to 50% of the prison population. There's not a higher crime rate. Every single study shows the crime rates between black and white and Latino, they're about the same. They're all within the margin of error. In fact, on drug crimes and gun crimes, white people are higher than black people. But yet, you have this over-policing. And so Crystal Mason got caught up in this. Not to say that she was innocent of the felony she committed. She absolutely committed it. But suffering the consequence of this racist felon disenfranchisement law, she went to vote because she was told you could vote. And she said, I'm not sure. And the poll worker said, okay, let's do this. File a provisional ballot. If you're eligible to vote, it'll be counted. If not, it'll be thrown out. That's the point of a provisional ballot. And so she did. And they charged her with voter fraud, even though her ballot never counted, even though she was acting on the advice of a poll worker. And in that same state, Ken Paxton, the corrupt AG of Texas, gets 0 prison for securities fraud. None. For securities fraud. Crystal Mason was a felon because of financial fraud. Paxton commits worse financial fraud and gets nothing for it. And he's the AG of Texas. Mississippi, poorest state in the nation, targeting black people in particular. Brett Favre gets 0 prison for allegedly stealing $5 million in welfare fraud. You guys, the system isn't broken. It's working as intended because the system cannot fail those it was never meant to protect in the first place. And you need to understand that racist systems don't persist due to ignorance. This is one of the biggest mythologies I had to disabuse myself of. That it's not ignorance why racist systems persist. It's due to new methods to continue to marginalize black and brown people. Right? The New Jim Crow is an excellent book that talks about this. Dr. Michelle Alexander. And we see that today, right? We went from slavery to the 13th Amendment passing prison slavery to continue to enslave black people. We went from Jim Crow laws to, after Jim Crow fell, mass incarceration and the war on drugs targeting black people, again, to deny black freedom. We went from the N-word as the pejorative to refer to black people to now substitutes for the N-word. CRT, woke, DEI, all to spread the same anti-black hate. Those aren't the N-word per se or directly, but they serve the same purpose. And that's the point. And so we solve this with systemic changes, not mere condemnations. We solve this with absolute justice, with new leadership, with representative leadership, with real representation. And again, and Professor Ibram Kendi talks about this, it's the difference between being not racist, which maintains the status quo and makes people feel good about themselves. Oh, I don't support racism. Well, that's great. What are you doing about it? Because saying you don't support racism is just not good enough. So it's the difference between being not racist and being anti-racist. Not racist maintains the status quo. Anti-racist advances justice and changes the status quo. Because the fact is, DEI was never about accepting unqualified black and brown people. It was always about ensuring qualified black and brown people also had a fair shot at acceptance despite systemic racism. And the didn't earn it you're thinking of are the legacy acceptance of Kavanaugh into Yale, or Trump into Wharton, or Bush into Yale. That's the didn't earn it. That's the legacy. That's the nepotism. All right, when we come back, we'll dive into the SCOTUS history, the Supreme Court history that's gotten us to this point in the first place. I just don't think people realize how destructive the Supreme Court has been to our basic rights throughout American history. And while it should have existed to protect our rights, it's actually, unfortunately, devastatingly, too often been the final nail in the coffin to deny us our rights. You're listening to the Qasim Rashid Show here on Sirius XM Urban View Channel 126. the most awesome show in the multiverse. We'll be right back after this break. Welcome back. You're listening to the Qasim Rashid Show here on Sirius XM Review Channel 126, the most awesome show in the multiverse. When we went to break, I was talking about how the Supreme Court has unfortunately been a massive thorn in the side of basic progress for our rights in this country. And we're seeing that play out today. So I wanted to do a deep dive just to disabuse anyone of the notion that the Supreme Court has been there to protect us. And right now, they just heard a case about banning mifepristone, which is an abortion drug taken immediately after conception. And the backstory is a Fifth Circuit MAGA judge in Texas banned mifepristone because, quote, the FDA failed to address concerns about whether the drug is safe for women, end quote. Now, this is a flat out lie. I mean, it's just a through and through lie. There's not a shred of truth to this. The FDA thoroughly studied mifepristone, thoroughly tested it, and approved it only after thorough and detailed investigations and processes. Mifepristone reports 5 deaths for every 1 million people who use it. That's a death rate of 0.0005%. And you're thinking, well, that still seems high. Okay. That's a higher death rate than the use of Tylenol. So if you've ever taken Tylenol, you have exposed yourself to more danger than a woman who takes mifepristone. It's a higher death rate than penicillin. If you've ever taken penicillin, you've exposed yourself to a higher death rate than mifepristone. So when do we ban those? Do tell. In fact, Viagra has a 15 times greater death rate than mifepristone. 15 times. When do we ban Viagra? Could you imagine? Could you imagine these MAGA nut jobs saying we need to ban Viagra? Could you imagine? It would be the funniest thing in the world. It would. I want someone, please, if you're listening and you have the means to file a lawsuit to ban Viagra under the exact same theory as mifepristone, just go to the legal case and just copy, do Control F and find all the mifepristone references and then just replace with Viagra and just make the exact same argument and just somebody file a lawsuit to ban Viagra, please. It would be amazing. And it's a 15 times higher death rate. So if MAGAs are behind banning mifepristone, then certainly the Viagra should be no problem whatsoever. Because MAGAs really care about life. And so the 28 women who have died since 2000 means we should apparently ban this drug permanently. In the meantime, since 2000, firearms have killed 900,000 people. And the GOP solution is we need even more guns. It was never about pro-life. It was always about pro-control of women. Somebody had the gall to reply to me on social media the other day that, well, 5 women per million are still 5 dead women. Plus, the baby almost always dies. So that's a bigger death rate than Viagra. Frankly, if killing kids is more important to you than stopping genocide, your priorities are weird. End quote. To which I replied, you get 0 points for your response. 5 women per million is far fewer than the 330 women per million who die from maternal mortality in the United States. So, by that standard, mifepristone is at least 66 times safer than childbirth. 66 times safer than childbirth. So it is just wild to me. It is completely unhinged to me that these people are actually trying to make this argument. And 2, I said to this person, what do you mean the baby almost always dies? There is no baby with mifepristone. That is the point. And then finally I said to him, or her, I can't tell who the person was, Frankly, if a fertilized egg is more human to you than the 15,000 actual children killed in Gaza, your priorities are backwards. So let's dive into this mess. And sadly, again, I want to reiterate, a big part of this has to do with the Supreme Court almost always being an arm and corrupt extension of right-wing extremism throughout American history. This is just a truth that we need to recognize. And again, I went to law school thinking Supreme Court is this paragon of justice, of virtue, of fighting for the little guy and stopping the big bad wolf from targeting individual people who are going to otherwise be torn to shreds. And I found the exact opposite to be true. A couple of years ago when the Supreme Court was about to repeal Roe, despite 72% of Americans favoring Roe, Clarence Thomas, the right-wing MAGA judge who's got Harlan Crow as his billionaire sugar daddy, complained. He says, we can't be an institution that can be bullied into giving you just the outcomes you want, end quote. But the problem with that statement is the Supreme Court has never reflected the American people, ever. They've always blocked what Americans actually want. And I'm going to start with a key case right before the Civil War, because by now we're on the cusp of the Civil War, and it should have been clear that Black people have equal rights. This is the very famous case, 1857, Dred Scott versus Sanford. And Supreme Court ruled 7-2 that Black people are subhuman and therefore cannot possibly be citizens, and therefore cannot possibly enjoy the constitutional promise of life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness. Where it says all men are created equal, that can't apply to Black people because they're not human. This ruling effectively prevented any peaceful solution to ending slavery. And scholars and historians agree that this likely further enabled the eventual Civil War in which 600,000 soldiers died. The Supreme Court could have prevented civil war with a peaceful, legal, logical, common sense, humane decision. But instead they voted 7-2 that nope, we would rather engage in a bloody civil war than recognize that Black people are human beings. 1883. Now we've gone through this bloody civil war. Now it should be explicitly clear that, yes, Black people are equal human beings. The 13th Amendment's been passed. 14th Amendment's been passed. Ending slavery, although allowing prison slavery. 14th Amendment providing equal protection under the law. The 1883 civil rights cases. Because so what happened is that in 1875, Congress passed the Civil Rights Acts of 1875. And I bet a bunch of you listening never even knew that. You've heard of the 1964, 1965 Civil Rights Acts, of course. But in 1875, Congress passed the Civil Rights Acts of 1875, guaranteeing many of the same rights enshrined in the 1964 Civil Rights Acts. SCOTUS rules 8-1. They get worse than Dred Scott. That the Civil Rights Act of 1875 is unconstitutional, and that the 13th and 14th Amendments do not provide equal protection of Black people. Hence, Jim Crow laws were valid. This is what these Black codes are valid. This poll testing is valid. The indentured servitude is valid. And this barbarity would stay on the books until 1964. Again, the Supreme Court set us back not just a civil war, but then another century of anti-Black, anti-brown, anti-woman bigotry, racism, and violence. The Supreme Court did that. 1896, Plessy versus Ferguson. Supreme Court ruled 7-1 that mandatory racial segregation was not in violation of the 14th Amendment. Again, furthering Black codes, furthering Jim Crow, furthering economic and educational disenfranchisement, and further strengthening the KKK and white supremacy. This is also when a vast majority of the KKK statues were erected as well. It's not history, folks. It's not the history of the Civil War, history of heritage. No, it's overt, outright white supremacy done to intimidate Black people and brown people, mostly Black people, and fully sanctioned by the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court did that. And it wasn't just racial injustice, it was also economic injustice, which I get the intersectionality, but I think you'll see my point when I talk about this 1918 case of Hammer versus Dagenhart. Supreme Court ruled 5-4 that Congress could not ban child labor in intrastate commerce. They called it a states' rights issue. Where have we heard that before? And as you see these labor cases come before the Supreme Court today, remember the Supreme Court's history is of enabling child labor and child abuse. As you see these MAGA nut jobs, like in Florida and Indiana, passing legislation to allow child labor as young as 14, remember the Supreme Court enabled this. 1924, Thind versus the United States. Supreme Court rules unanimously, 9-0, that though a Punjabi Sikh named Bhagat Thind was Aryan, per the USA's then eugenicist definition of white, he did not meet the, quote, common sense, quote, definition of white, because he had a beard, brown skin, and wore a turban. And therefore, he could not be a citizen. And the Supreme Court went on to extend the ban on Chinese immigration to a ban on all immigration, period. 1924, total ban of Asian immigration. Meanwhile, we had basically open borders from Europe. 50 million European immigrants came in from, I think, 1884 to 1924, give or take a couple of years, but 50 million without any documentation, open borders. I don't hear anybody complaining about immigration at that time. 1927, Buck v. Bell. Supreme Court said, you know what? We need to get back in the business of targeting Black people. They ruled 8-1, upholding a Virginia eugenics law targeting Black people that allowed forced sterilization of Black people. States nationwide would then adopt this law, and more than 60,000 Black women, men, and children as young as 10 years old were forcibly sterilized. And as of 2024, Buck v. Bell is still valid precedent. It was never actually overturned. Supreme Court did that. 1927, less than a century ago. 1944, Supreme Court said, let's get back to Asian hate. Korematsu versus United States. Supreme Court rules 6-3, upholding FDR's Executive Order 9066 to forcibly intern 120,000 Americans of Japanese descent. Now, mind you, America was also at war with Germany and Italy, but only Japanese Americans suffered mass arrest, deprivation of property, denial of basic civil rights, and thrown into concentration camps, all in the backdrop of the United States fighting Nazi fascism while engaging in American fascism at home. 1986, Bowers versus Hardwick. Supreme Court rules 5-4, upholding a Georgia statute criminalizing even private LGBTQ relationships. And though this was finally overruled in 2005, Lawrence v. Texas, anti-sodomy law still exists in several states, and anti-LGBTQ discrimination is still at an all-time high. Again, the Supreme Court did this. The Supreme Court. Many of you remember that case. Many of you also remember Gore v. Bush in 2000. Supreme Court ruled 7-2 in favor of George W. Bush, handing him the presidency. This despite Al Gore winning the popular vote by more than 500,000 votes, despite counting not even being completed in Florida. And as we know, Bush then went on to bankrupt our surplus, cut billionaire taxes, left America trillions in debt, waged 2 failed wars, and enabled the horrific atrocities we're seeing today by pushing the envelope of any sense of decency. 2008, Exxon Shipping Company versus Baker, because the Supreme Court said we also need to attack the environment. Climate catastrophe be damned. Supreme Court rules 5-3 to protect Exxon from punitive damages in which a drunk operator spilled 11 million gallons into an ecologically sensitive sound. Supreme Court dropped the fine from $5 billion to $500 million, boosting Exxon's value by $23 billion. And Justice Alito, the right-wing MAGA, who voted to protect Exxon, just happened to own a ton of Exxon stock. What a coincidence. Gosh, I wish we had some kind of ethics reform in the Supreme Court. 2010, Citizens United. Now the Supreme Court's like, let's just target people in general. Let's just screw over American people in general. Supreme Court rules in Citizens United versus FEC 5-4 that the First Amendment protects political donations as free speech because corporations are people, which opens elections to billions in dark money to buy and sell politicians. More than 90% of Americans oppose this ruling, but Supreme Court says, we don't care. We're not going to be bullied by what the people want. We're going to do what our billion-dollar donors tell us to do. 2013, let's get back to targeting Black people. Shelby County versus Holder, the Supreme Court rules 5-4 to gut the Voting Rights Act, specifically provisions that prevented historically discriminatory states and counties from disenfranchising Black, Indigenous, and Latino voters. After Shelby, red states closed hundreds and hundreds of polling locations in Black and Latino neighborhoods. Texas, for example, closed more than 500 locations in predominantly Black and Latino areas that served about 2.5 million Black and Latino Texans. 500. I'm telling you, states like Texas are not red states. They're voter suppression states. There are more Democrats who voted for Biden in the 2000 election in Texas than in New York. 2016, again, the Supreme Court tries to screw over the American people, rules 5-3 in Utah versus Strife to permit police to admit evidence when prosecuting somebody, even if that evidence was procured by an illegal search and seizure. God, if only we had a Fourth Amendment that specifically banned illegal search and seizures. And again, this particularly targets Black and brown people who face 6 to 9 times higher charge and arrest rates than white people. 2020, Trump versus Hawaii. We, of course, remember Supreme Court rules to uphold Trump's racist and discriminatory Muslim ban, a ban he admitted was designed to cause as much harm as possible, and one he could not prove at any national security value whatsoever. So much for the ban on religious tests. 2021, Nestle USA versus Doha. The Supreme Court rules 8-1 that children kidnapped, enslaved, and forced to go to the Ivory Coast to produce for American corporate giants like Nestle could not sue Nestle for damages for knowingly enabling child slave labor. And yeah, it's as horrific as it sounds. This is the Supreme Court history that we have to deal with. This is why I firmly believe in term limits. I believe in expanding the court. And frankly, I believe if a president didn't win the majority of the vote of the American people, shouldn't be appointing judges in the first place. Look, I could go on. There's so many more cases that I can't get into because we only have a few minutes left before we have to go to break. But this is why representation matters. 94% of Supreme Court justices have been white men, most of whom were white supremacists. And I'm going to say that again. Most of them were white supremacists. Up until recently, you could argue they weren't. But the majority, up until through the 1960s at least, were white supremacists. Less interested in justice and more interested in preserving white supremacy. How else do you explain the Dred Scott ruling? How else do you explain the Thin versus United States ruling? How else do you explain the Korematsu ruling? How else do you explain the stripping down of basic voter rights? 2, this is why we need to expand the court to 13. It was set to 9 when there were 9 districts. Now there are 13 districts. So in fairness and in precedent, we've expanded the court, I think 7 or 8 times in the past. It makes simple presidential sense to expand the court. What's radical is to keep it this small. Let's add meaningful representation to the court ASAP. And look, finally, we can both be angry at Democrats for not doing enough and recognize we can keep doing more to vote out extremists and the corporate bot Republicans and Democrats. That's why I ran for Congress. Wasn't successful, but hey, we're not giving up that easy. It's critical we vote for people who will actually fight for working families. And that happens by not just voting, but by organizing, by donating, by knocking doors, by making phone calls. Right? I saw a recent podcast where former Miami Heat star Dwayne Wade talked about how he watched Ray Allen backpedal from the paint to the side 3-point line over and over and over again in practice. He goes, I probably saw him do it 1,000 times, where he didn't have to look at where his feet were set. He could just do it and shoot. And in the NBA Finals, the game-winning shot that he hit over the Boston Celtics was exactly that. Practiced it thousands of times for one shot, and he hit it. And that's how we win elections. We organize effectively throughout the year, throughout the years, and when it comes time for election day, we win. That's how we're going to ensure justice. That's how we're going to ensure meaningful representation. So I'm sorry if I crushed your soul on how jacked up the Supreme Court is, but I'm glad that we have these conversations, because the more engaged and informed we are, the better able we are to cure this cancer of injustice and replace it with meaningful justice and representation. All right, you're listening to the Qasim Rashid Show here on Sirius XM Urban View Channel 126, the most awesome show in the multiverse. When we come back, we'll talk about Gaza and the UN ceasefire resolution that passed 14-0, and the fact that despite this resolution, Israel continues to bomb Gaza. Don't go away. We'll be right back after this break. Welcome back. You're listening to the Qasim Rashid Show here on Sirius XM Urban View Channel 126, the most awesome show in the multiverse. I hope I didn't crush your hopes and dreams about the Supreme Court with that last segment, but I think it's important that we reiterate that every now and then to emphasize just how critical it is we stay engaged and don't lose hope. Let's close by talking about Gaza. The UN finally passed a ceasefire resolution unanimously, 14-0. And the United States, which I don't know what to do anymore. The United States insisted on changing the word permanent to lasting, and then abstained from voting. They just abstained. They didn't object, which is good, but they went through all the trouble of demanding a change to the resolution, and then they abstained from voting altogether, which, okay. But nonetheless, finally, for the first time since this horrific siege on Gaza began, there is now a ceasefire resolution demanding immediate ceasefire and immediate and unconditional release of all hostages. Antonio Guterres, who is the Secretary General of the UN, said, quote, the Security Council just approved a long-awaited resolution on Gaza, demanding an immediate ceasefire and the immediate and unconditional release of all hostages. This resolution must be implemented. Failure would be unforgivable. And the resolution was also voted on not only by China and Russia, who of course are no allies, but by many allies of the United States, including Japan, Slovenia, Switzerland, Sierra Leone, Korea. And this is significant because now U.S. allies are openly defying the U.S. and refusing to align with them on Israel, which is, again, it's a step towards, I think, the global movement for there to be meaningful justice, right? Meaningful justice and meaningful accountability. Now, the reality is that since this has happened, Israel has continued to bomb Gaza. And the United States was asked about this, and they said, well, we consider this a non-binding resolution. And I just want to emphasize again, there is no such thing as a non-binding UN Security Council resolution. None. It just doesn't exist. You can't have a binding UN Security Council and then say it's a non-binding resolution. It's an oxymoron. It's made up. It's gobbledygook, as an old law professor used to say when explaining bad decisions. Look, the UN Security Council has the authority to enforce these resolutions. They have the authority to do so in a number of ways. They can impose economic sanctions. They can impose arms embargoes. They can impose financial penalties and restrictions. They can issue travel bans. They can sever diplomatic relations. They can enforce a blockade. And yes, they can enforce collective military action. The UN has the authority by international law, by binding international resolutions, by binding international human rights law to enforce all of these things. And it's mind-boggling to me that the United States would look at all this and say, nope, it's non-binding. It's just not true. I was looking up at the orgs demanding Israel stop its illegal blockade of Gaza, which is resulting in famine and starvation. They include the United Nations, Oxfam, UNICEF, B'Tselem, an Israeli human rights organization, the Red Cross, the International Red Cross, Amnesty International, Refugees International, Save the Children, Humanity First International, the World Food Program, Human Rights Watch, Doctors Without Borders, the World Health Organization. Look, if you find yourself on the wrong side of history of all these organizations, you need to ask yourself, are we the baddies? Right? Like that famous meme from the movie. Like, why are you on the wrong side of all these organizations who are saying children are starving? Maybe we should stop starving children. This is not a controversial take. In response to this resolution, Netanyahu got furious and canceled an Israeli delegation to the White House to discuss Rafah. And I'll close with this because this is mind-blowing to me. His insistence on now invading Rafah. To what end? To what end? There's already enough horrifying videos of the Israeli military sniping and killing Israeli civilians. I'm sorry, Palestinian civilians. Well, they did kill the Israeli hostages too. There's now ample evidence that the Israeli military has committed sexual assault of Palestinian women in Al-Shifa hospital. And last week, the Israeli government announced an expansion of settlements in the West Bank, direct violation of international human rights law. And now Netanyahu is so upset that he's canceled the delegation to discuss Rafah. First of all, there's nothing to discuss. Forced displacement is a war crime, which is what the Israeli government's been doing this whole time. Moreover, if you're so upset, then return the $3.8 billion in tax money that we just sent you. But you're not going to do that because you're not really that upset. You're just upset that you're being held accountable to basic international human rights law. Look, the UN Security Council ceasefire order has been violated. Where is the accountability? Call your senators, call your state reps, your federal reps, and ask them to demand accountability because this is simply unsustainable. All right, guys, that's all we have for the show today. My call to action for each of you is go to my link tree, go to any of my social media, click on the link tree, and sign up to my newsletter at the link in my bio. Stay tuned on next steps. I'm upset I didn't win this run for Congress, but for me, public service isn't about having a title. It's about public service, and that happens irrespective of the title. Not to say I didn't want to win. I absolutely did. My point is the work will continue, and I need you to be part of it. Sign up on my newsletter so we can communicate independent of social media with algorithms that social media has and the shadow banning. I'm not all about that life. I need to make sure we can have meaningful and direct conversations. Sign up and stay tuned for next steps. And, you know, this week's kind of special for me. It's a 37-year anniversary of my immigration to the United States. 37 years ago. I got here as a chubby little kid, not knowing a word of English. Now I've got a chubby dad bod, and I think I know probably at least 28 words of English. So I'm getting there. Thank you, my friends, for tuning in. Be sure to follow us on social media at Qasim Rashid across all platforms. You have my promise to continue to advance the show that builds on compassion, that builds on justice, that builds on accountability for those in power. We've got a great show lined up for next week. Be sure to tune in at the same time, same place at 10 a.m. on Sunday, right here on Sirius XM Overview Channel 1 26, the most awesome show in the multiverse. My friends, be fierce, lead with compassion and justice, and continue speaking truth to power. Till next week, peace.
Keep It Real with Al Sharpton.
Last year, there was some that burned down buildings in Minneapolis after George Floyd. We marched, we rallied, but we never rallied around those that burned down the stores. They're condoning what they did January 6th. So some of the Republicans say, well, we're not telling people to go. You're not telling them don't go either. Well, Trump didn't endorse it. He didn't refute it either.
Keep It Real with Al Sharpton. Weekdays, 6 p.m. East on Sirius XM's Urban View, where talk empowers and becomes action. The Lou Hutt Show with financial expert Lou Hutt.
Tax avoidance, that's the use of legal methods and strategies for reducing taxable income. Perfectly legitimate. On the other hand, tax evasion can put you in jail. It's hiding assets. It's camouflaging information in order to dodge tax liability. Tax evasion, we're not in that game.
The Lou Hutt Show, Sirius XM's Urban View, where talk empowers and becomes action.